Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Professor Bob Long. Now, if you're watching these videos, you're either enrolled in my class, so you need to learn the material that I put on the board, the way that I teach it, that I cover from my laboratories and lectures, through my notes and my list of things to know. If you're not enrolled in my class, then you need to cover the material that your instructor covers. Now, if you're not in my class but you find the videos helpful, please hit like and subscribe and you'll get some updates. It'll give me some feedback. So, we're going to be doing some laboratory videos for the muscles. Before I go over the models of the muscles, the names of muscles, when you look at the list, the muscles are named with all these whacked out crazy names. And they're hard for a lot of people to learn. But a lot of the names come from either the skeletal components that they're attached to, or for some other reasons, some regional terminology. In order to better understand where the names of muscles are derived, I like to go over some of the ways that muscles have been derived, or the names of the muscles have been derived, and I like to write that on the board and let you see this. Then when we get into the list and the actual muscles, the names will make a lot more sense to you. So, when it comes to naming the muscles were named in a variety of ways. One of the ways that the muscles are named is for their body region, or we could say simply the location. Okay, so some of the muscles are going to have names that involve the body regions. There's a muscle that sits right here over the temporal bone called the temporalis muscle. There's a muscle that sits over the frontal bone called the frontalis, the occipitalis. The pectoralis muscles are named for the pectoral region. All the abdominal muscles have abdominis in their name. Some of the leg muscles have femoris in the name. The brachium is your upper arm, so anytime a muscle has brachii or brachii or brachial in the name, it's here. Some of the muscles are named for the glutes. So a number of the muscles of the human body are going to be named for the body region and or location. A second way that the muscles are named are for what we call the bony attachments. What are the bony structures, or the landmarks, to which the muscles are attached? Now, when we study a muscle, I'm going to do sort of a generic drawing here. If I have one bone or bony structure, and I have another one here, the muscles aren't attached directly muscle to bone. They have these connective tissue pieces, which would be called tendons. And those tendons are connective tissue fibers, dense connective tissue, to which, sorry, let me grab another marker here. That connective tissue that makes up the tendons, the dense connective tissue, all the collagen fibers, are actually interwoven around each individual muscle cell as a structure we call the endomysium. And so they're kind of woven together and tied. So if I tied two ropes together and I pull on one rope, it pulls on the other. So when the muscle contracts, it pulls on the tendon, which pulls on the bone. Now, as the muscle attaches here, the fibers would be running like this. Now, when this muscle contracts, if this bone does not move, but this one does, or this bony attachment doesn't move and this one does, we call this one the origin. That's the bony structure to which the muscle attached that does not move. So it's the attachment that does not move. The other bony structure is called the insertion. So where the muscle originates and inserts, or the origin and insertion, this would be the attachment that moves. Now, sometimes they say this is the more superior or proximal attachment, this is the more distal, or this is the more central and the more medial and the more lateral. But really, essentially, if it doesn't move, it's the origin. If it moves, it's the insertion. For the most part, there's some exceptions to the rule. So, there's a muscle that attaches from the coracoid process to the brachial region, and it's called the coracobrachialis. It's a good example. There's one that attaches from your sternum and your clavicle to the mastoid process called the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So when we look at the name of a muscle, some of the muscles are named for their origin and insertion, or the bony attachments. Okay? Now, I'm going to erase this. Another way that muscles can be named is for their action. So in lecture, we talked about joint movements or actions of muscles. Flexion, extension, or at the wrist, flexion, extension, and hyperextension. So we have a bunch of movements of the body, and some muscles, part of their name is derived from whichever action they perform. For example, a lot of the muscles on the front part of your forearm and the antebrachium here would flex my wrist. So they have the word flexor in the name. And actually, sometimes we combine several of these. So a couple of them are called flexor carpi something because they flex the carpal region, your wrist. The muscles on the back of my forearm would extend and hyperextend my wrist, so they all have extensor carpi in the name. And actually, more of the body region would be the bone that they're associated with. I have a flexor carpi radialis, I have a flexor carpi ulnaris. I have an extensor carpi radialis and extensor carpi ulnaris. So the names tell you the action and where they're found. One of the motions was to move away from midline, or abduction, abduction, or move closer to midline. So on the inside of our thigh, there are some muscles that pull the legs closer together, and they all have the word adductor in the name for adduction. There's a few more that we could talk about, but I'm just giving you some general examples. Now, on occasion, there is a group of muscles, 2, 3, or more, that have the exact same body region, the exact same attachments, and the exact same action. If there's more than one muscle that has all of this, then how do we delineate which muscle is which? Well, a lot of times that is based on the size of the muscle. So, if you see the term maximus in the name, maximus would be the largest of the group. For example, your gluteal muscles will attach from the posterior spines of the iliac bone all the way to where the trochanters are on the femur, the proximal femur. So they have the same attachments, they're all in the gluteal region, and they all extend and hyperextend the hip. So one of the muscles is called the gluteus maximus. It is the biggest of the three. There's another one called the gluteus medius. That's usually the mid-sized one of the group. And if you see the term minimus, that means it's the smallest of the group. We also will see that in our forearm and in our ankle, we have some muscles that are called flexor carpi radialis longus, flexor carpi, there's a flexor quinti minimus, and it's the smallest that would flex the fifth finger, quinti from cinco, 5. We may not see all of these, but later in your study, you'll see some of these terminology and you'll know what it means. Now, if we have a very large muscle, then we use the term magnus. So there's an adductor magnus, which is a really large muscle, covers a large area. There's also an adductor brevis, and we'll talk about those. Those are based on length, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then there's another term called the vastus. Vastus means it covers a large area, okay? So all of these are related to the size of a muscle. There's a vastus medialis, a vastus lateralis, there's an adductor magnus, there's a gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, gluteus minimus. So when some muscles are named based on their size. Now, a fifth way that we can name muscles is based on their length. So, if you see the term longus, it is the longer of the two. And if you see the term brevis, it is the shorter of the two. Anytime I have a muscle named something longus, that means there's going to be another one with the exact same name, but something called the brevis. So there's the tibialis anterior longus, the tibialis anterior brevis. There's the flexor carpi radialis longus, the flexor carpi radialis brevis. So anytime you see a longus, there's a brevis. One is longer, one is shorter. Okay. Another way that we can name muscles is basically on what we say the workload. And this isn't exactly the best terminology for it, but which one does more of the movement? So sometimes we have two muscles that have the same name, but one does more work, the other one does less work. And so if you see a major and a minor, the major does more of the action, the minor does the same stuff, but it's helping a little bit. Kind of like if you have a couple of big guys carrying something and then you have a little guy that looks like he's helping, the major and the minor. So we have like, what's a good example? The zygomaticus major and the zygomaticus minor right here where the zygomatic bone is. They help lift your lip. So we're going to be seeing some of these in the models. Now, another way that muscles are named is for the muscle shape. So this is the Greek letter delta. So if we have a muscle that's shaped like that, it's called a deltoid muscle. If we have a ring-shaped muscle, then that can be called an orbicularis muscle. If we have a muscle that is shaped like a big rhombus, like this, then that muscle will have the term rhomboideus in the name, or rhomboid in the name. If you have a muscle that's shaped like a funky looking old school kite, that is a trapezoid, so we would say that's the trapezius muscle. So some of the muscles, like the muscle up here, the bottom part of the delta would be up here, and it would insert at the deltoid tuberosity, called the deltoid muscle. We have a muscle that makes a ring around our eyes, called the orbicularis oculi, one that makes a ring around your mouth, called the orbicularis oris. We have a muscle that helps us row or pull our shoulder blades together that are shaped like this, called the rhomboideus major, and there's a minor. And then we have a muscle that covers a lot of our back called the trapezius muscle, or the trapezoid. Now, I'm running out of board space. Let me make sure that you can see all of this on the screen. Yeah, I'm right on the edge of my screen, so I'm sorry about that. There you go. Now, I'm running out of room, so let me add this in over here. There's another shape that muscles can come in, and that shape is said to be a serratus muscle. If it looks like it has teeth on one side, like a serrated knife, we call that a serratus muscle, S-E-R-R-A-T-U-S. And I think there's a few other shapes, but these are the major ones. Now, let me erase all of this, and I'll continue to go over a few more ways that muscles are named. Another name for muscles, or way that muscles were named, is based on the number of heads. What does that mean? Well, again, if I have a bony structure that a muscle originates on, and I have a bony structure that the muscle inserts upon, most muscles are somewhat tubular in shape. And so the muscle fibers would run along this way, like this. And while you may not know this yet, you're about to learn, the middle of the muscle is referred to as the belly of the muscle. If this is the origin up here, then this part of the muscle that attaches to the tendon that goes to the origin would be called the head of the muscle, and this part down here would be called the tail of the muscle. So a lot of muscles have a head, a belly, and a tail. Now, there's a muscle in our upper arm in the brachial region that has some of the fibers that actually split off. They're all interwoven down here with one tail, but this muscle has two heads. So if it has two heads, it gets the name biceps. There's a biceps muscle in the upper arm. There's a biceps muscle in the back of our thigh called the biceps brachii and the biceps femoris. Okay. Another way that muscles can be named, or actually there's a muscle that has three heads, and that one is called the triceps muscle. And it has three heads on the back of your arm, back here. And so this muscle right here is called the triceps muscle, the triceps brachii. When you name these on the lab test, you have to give me the complete name. There was a muscle, or was thought to be a muscle in the front of our leg called the quadriceps. It was thought to be a muscle with four heads. But later on, upon dissection, they realized it's four separate muscles. but we still call them the quads or the quadriceps muscles. Now, finally, I believe this is the last way that I want to show you that muscles are named. Muscles can be named based on the direction of muscle fibers. So, if I have a regular cell here, any cell in the human body, like a skin cell or something, when I look at a muscle cells are unique in a number of ways, and one way is their size, especially when it comes to skeletal muscle cells. The muscle cell could extend from here all the way across the board and be a very large cell. Let me make sure I'm still within my frame of reference. Good. So, because they looked like long ropes, they were called muscle fibers. A muscle fiber is a muscle cell, also called a myocyte. And when I look at muscle cells, they're not really short cells, they're very long rope-like cells, so they're called muscle fibers. And the fibers usually run the length of the muscle. Now, if we're standing in correct anatomical position, and those muscle fibers all run vertically, then we would call this a rectus muscle. Rect means straight, so if they run straight up and down, they're called the rectus, like the rectus abdominis. We have one that runs straight up and down the femur bone called the rectus femoris. If the muscle fibers run across the body, the term for across is transverse, and so we have a muscle that runs across our belly, also called the transverse abdominis. If the muscle fibers run at angles, then that can be called an oblique muscle. So now, when I go through all these ways that we're naming muscles, a lot of times they're named for region, for action, for origin, insertion, for the direction of the muscle fibers. So we'll see rectus abdominis, transverse abdominis, and the abdominal obliques. Some muscles are named because they're between the ribs, like intercostals, or for certain regions of the face. When you start to look at the names of the muscles on the list, you'll see all of these terms combined, and a lot of times the name will tell you what to look for and where to find it. It makes learning these complex names for muscles much easier. Okay? One last thing I want to show you. Since most muscles are tubular in shape, if we cut the muscle and look down on the end, if I cut this muscle right here and looked at it, I would see the muscle fibers running this way, and they're rather ring-shaped. Occasionally, we have a piece of muscle tissue that is flat. When we have a flat muscle, and it has some flat tendons coming off of it, very often the tendons are flat as well. And a flat tendon can go by several names. And the names vary based on some other details, which I'm not going to go into completely, but they can be called a fascia. They can be called an aponeurosis. And sometimes they're referred to as a tract or band. So we'll see some of these terms used as well. Fascia, aponeurosis, or tract or band, or sometimes they'll use the term sheath. We have a flat tendon that runs over our stomach called the rectus sheath. We have a plantar aponeurosis and epicranial aponeurosis. We have the iliotibial tract or iliotibial band, a lateral fascial band. We have all these terms that we're going to use. So I wanted to introduce all these concepts to you so that when we learn the muscles, as we go through the list, you'll go, oh man, that's so much easier than I thought it would be if you just went over the muscle names themselves. Okay? Thanks for watching. I hope you had as much fun as I did, and I'll see you in the videos with the models.